Hello, everyone, and welcome to Johnny's Ambassadors Expert Webinar Series for Parents. I am your host, Laura Stack, the founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors, where we educate parents and teens about the dangers of today's high THC marijuana, especially on adolescent brain development, mental illness, and suicide. We have a wonderful guest with us today, whom I will introduce in just a moment. After I run through a couple quick logistics, this session is being recorded. Please share it with your friends and family. There is a handout that Jordan has kindly provided with thumbnails of his slides and room for notes. That is in the handout section of your control panel, or if you are watching this video, it is on the page where you are watching. Jordan will present for about 45 minutes with his slides, after which he will take your questions for about 15 minutes. So as you think of them, if you could please type them into the questions box in your control panel, I will read those off to him in the order that they came in. So please ask questions about your situation, about your child, anything that you want to know about the topic that he is covering today. So now let me introduce to you Jordan Haan, who is the executive director of the Recovery Guides in Denver, Colorado. He first encountered behavioral health problems at the age of 13 when he started to experience depression and anxiety. In the span of 6 months, he went from a happy, driven kid to struggling with suicidal ideation and failing all his classes. He found cannabis and felt relief for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He immediately latched onto it and quickly progressed into more and harder substances while always keeping cannabis as a constant. It was only through going to treatment that he slowly began to see that there was an alternative. And looking back, entering treatment for the first time was truly the point where his whole life began to change, and he yearned to be able to be some small part of that process for others. Jordan, thank you so much for being one of Johnny's ambassadors.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, and I appreciate the introduction. This is something definitely near and dear to my heart, and I personally was not able to get to treatment while I was still a teen. It was actually in early adulthood. I was 21 years old when I first went, but I've been spending really the last 5 years of my life really focused on helping people get their teens to treatment. And so, that leads us to kind of the title of this presentation: how to get teens to treatment and how to find proper help for your child. So first is intervention. This is a term that I'm sure everyone has heard. Perhaps you've even seen the TV show on A&E. And many people don't really know what an intervention is and what the different types are, or they don't even know that there are different types. And the big question I get frequently is, how do we find an interventionist? Because we get queries from people all over the country. And so basically, intervention is a method for socially compelling persons to accept help and engage with some sort of treatment. It is not only specific to substance use. It is also used for, mental health primary or eating disorders or any sort of sexual compulsion. It's pretty widespread in its application. There are two more common classical intervention models. They all kind of derive from the Johnson model format that was developed in the 60s. And those two models are invitational or surprise. So a surprise intervention would probably be the one that most people are more familiar with. It is, they invite the identified loved one to, just come over, or they have some sort of pretext for why the person is supposed to be there. And then when the identified loved one arrives, they are confronted by all the members of the intervention team, and they will often read off of letters, and really the whole the what it all hinges on is just it's family involvement. Oftentimes they leverage bottom lines very heavily. You know, they will say, and if you don't accept help today, we can no longer be a part of your life, or we can't support you, or whatever it may be. The level of reliance on bottom lines will vary depending on the interventionist and what kind of submodality they're using. We personally use a break-free model of intervention, which is an invitational intervention. And kind of the goal with invitational intervention is to remove some of the confrontation from it by actually inviting the identified loved one to take place in the family meeting. So oftentimes the invitation would take place 24 to 48 hours before the actual intervention, and they would put out the request to the identified loved one stating, they wouldn't necessarily call it an intervention, but they would let them know that, hey, we're going to have a family meeting. We've invited someone to help us conduct this, and we're going to be having it regardless of whether or not you're there, but we would much rather have you there. And to the question of how do you find an interventionist? Typically, people are finding them through word of mouth referral. Oftentimes it'll be, they're searching on Google for local treatment centers or a good treatment center. They'll call the treatment center. They'll say, I don't know how to get my son or daughter or husband or wife to this program, and the treatment center will make a referral to a local or out-of-state interventionist. I would say one of the best online resources for finding a competent interventionist would be the Association of Intervention Specialists. Most members of the Association of Intervention Specialists are also CIPs, or Certified Intervention Professionals, through the Pennsylvania Certification Board. And the Pennsylvania Certification Board is a board member with ICNRC, which is an international kind of certification overseer. You really have to be careful when you're looking for an interventionist and you see these different, credentials that people have, because a lot of them really don't mean much. A lot of these intervention credentials means they sat through a 6-hour Zoom meeting and then received a printout of their certified interventionist credential. CIP is definitely the most significant intervention credential by far. Next, we have crisis navigation. So crisis navigation is really a rapid response, less formal type of intervention. It's oftentimes utilized in places where there is a more immediate crisis, like let's say the person is in jail, or they've just been hospitalized and placed on a mental health hold, or they're in the hospital for an overdose, or some sort of more immediate crisis, where you can capitalize on this sense of urgency, right? It's when someone is in the hospital as a result of substance use or some sort of mental health disorder, the consequences are very real and immediately tangible, and it can oftentimes be a much easier time to do a rapid response crisis navigation or intervention and have a very good success rate in getting them to attend some actual treatment. One important thing to keep in mind, though, is that if someone's safety is ever of immediate concern, the best thing to do is call 911. You should not call an interventionist if you are worried about someone's immediate safety, and this could include if someone is actively suicidal, or if they're overdosing, or you think they're using especially recklessly and approaching the level of an overdose. It's always best to call EMS, 911, etc., and you just have the only proper response to those situations is to escalate. As interventionists, we frequently work with and call law enforcement or EMS as part of our job. And this could include when we're doing wellness checks. Families will oftentimes, let's take the situation of, I haven't talked to my son in a week. I know he's holed up in his apartment. No one has heard from him. We're really worried for his safety. We will actually go to the apartment. We will knock on it. If no one's answering, we will then call the police. They will come by. They will knock as well. If there's no answer, we will come back the next day. Again, we will knock. We will see if we can get them to come to the door. If they don't, we will again call 911 to initiate a wellness check, or actually the non-emergency line, but still to call EMS. And the more days in a row you do it, the further that the police are able to actually escalate it, and it can even get to the point where the police can legally request a master key, from the building or landlord to actually open the door and check on the person, as long as there is, significant concern about their well-being. The other most common question we get as interventionists is, how do you know where to place your loved one in treatment? Figuring out the appropriate placement can be a daunting task, and the reality is that searching online has a lot of barriers, because it's not, just because a program is ranked at the top of a search engine really has nothing to do with the quality of the treatment. It really has more to do with how much they're spending on search engine optimization, or how much they're spending on Google AdWords, and it's a poor method for finding it. And there's a lot of these websites that it'll say, call this number to get help now, and it'll just redirect you to a call center, and the call center is just being paid by programs, regardless of their efficacy, to reroute qualified leads to them. Word of mouth can be a good way of finding a treatment center. Honestly, if you really, like, let's say you need to stay in network for financial reasons, and you need a place that will be reimbursed by insurance, I mean, one of the best things you can do is just call the number on the back of your insurance card. I recommend this to families all the time. Especially if your loved one is willing to go, and you don't have significant cash resources to contribute to the process, one of the best things you can do is just call the number on the back of your insurance card, explain what's going on, potentially get an assessment from a clinician prior to choosing the actual program, and then going with one of those local in-network referrals from the insurance company. We also have what's called therapeutic consultants. So within the realms of private treatment offerings throughout the United States, by far the most knowledgeable persons are therapeutic consultants, many or even most of whom are clinicians themselves. And basically what therapeutic consultants do is for their full-time job, they travel the country visiting these different programs, and they know them in extreme detail. Like, so to give you an example, we were working with a consultant recently, and they had a client, and they knew to place him at this one specific wilderness program and to request this one specific therapist, because they knew the therapist had dealt with clients with a similar, history, right? They had, in this specific case, the child's father had passed away at a younger age, and they had firsthand seen the work that therapist had done with children whose fathers had passed away at a young age. That gives you some idea of the level of detail that therapeutic consultants understand the different program offerings. Another thing to keep in mind is that every quality interventionist should be willing and desire to work with any clinicians who are currently working with your loved one, right? It's, those people have the best idea of kind of just what the situation is. And this could be a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a therapist. And if there isn't a clinician, the interventionist should always one, they should have one that they work with regularly, that they can involve in the process, as long as the family is willing and desiring it. But at the minimum, they should be willing to bring one in should the family request it. It's very important to keep in mind that interventionists are not it's not a medical service, right? It's not the same type of, it's not licensure in the way of a therapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And so you really want to be careful when you're looking at interventionists, that you're finding one who understands the correct role they should be playing within the behavioral health care continuum. Next, we have adolescent transport. What is adolescent transport? How does it work, and when is it necessary? Adolescent transport is a service used to get treatment-resistant minors into treatment. They are often and usually structured as mandatory style of transports, where the adolescent doesn't have a choice in whether or not they will go. One should be extremely cautious when choosing an adolescent transport company and ask questions like, is your company insured specifically for adolescent transport? Because it's not, a lot of them are not. And what is your staff's experience with these? Are your staff trained and experienced in traditional intervention? And do you have a list of references I can call? Adolescent transport requires really a lot of skill to be done correctly. And if it's done incorrectly, the reality is that it could be, needlessly traumatizing to the adolescent. Adolescent transport is extremely common with wilderness programs and therapeutic boarding schools, but it's also used regularly with more traditional, in-network insurance-driven adolescent treatment programs. But especially with wilderness programs and therapeutic boarding schools, it's definitely the majority of their clients are brought to them through adolescent transport. Next, we have recovery detective. So how do licensed private investigators integrate with behavioral health? Private investigators can integrate with behavioral health cases when there is a missing person. That's the primary use for a recovery detective, but it's also utilized for pre-intervention surveillance if there's certain facts or features of the case that are unknown, but there's a suspicion towards, they can run surveillance prior to the actual family meeting or prior to even making the firm decision to have a family meeting. It's also utilized for lifestyle audits of heirs and beneficiaries or benefactors. It's important to utilize private investigators with behavioral health experience when you are integrating them with a behavioral health case. Oftentimes, only finding the loved one, if it is a missing persons case, is not enough to elicit change, right? You need them to be integrated with a team that can act on the information. So let's say you have a missing persons case. You spend a week searching and interviewing people, trying to find their location. You find them, okay, now what? It's best if you have them, one who is an interventionist as well, or who is paired with a larger care team that includes interventionists and clinicians to be able to make the proper placement, find them, and actually get them to agree to go. We have case management and in-home support. What is it? Is it necessary? And how does it work? Case management is a service that follows your loved one in the family system throughout the recovery process to ensure that proper next steps are always being taken and that everyone in the family system is doing their part to reach fuller healing. You'll often hear that addiction is a family disease, and that's because it impacts, it impacts more than the loved one who's the one most obviously experiencing issues. It creates trauma throughout the family system, and that's why the best way of healing is when every member of the family takes part in healing of their own. And this could include support groups like Al-Anon. It could include going to therapy themselves. And sometimes it even includes members of the family going to treatment as well. And let's take the case of, one case we were working recently. It's that the son was placed in treatment for a substance use disorder and mental health, but then the mom was actually placed in treatment for codependency. So, the specific issues that are being treated are different, but everyone really needs to do their part in seeking healing for a better and more lasting effect. In-home support staff. This is oftentimes called recovery coaching or sober companion. This is a service that places peer support professionals into the client's home. The best way to think of a recovery coach or sober companion, or as my company calls it, in-home support staff, is like a customizable behavioral health technician. Really, the analogy I like to give is what is a treatment center, right? You have the home, you have, it's oftentimes ran out of the home. Then you have the clinicians facilitating individual and group therapy. And then a huge component of it is actually the behavioral health technicians that are doing the day-to-day rule enforcement. They're providing most of the supervision. They are the real-time shoulder to cry on. They're doing real-time de-escalation. Most of the client interaction is going to be facilitated by behavioral health technicians rather than the actual clinicians. Private in-home treatment is often facilitated with this as a huge component of it. So for example, I've managed private treatment programs in Los Angeles and elsewhere, where it's private location, there's 24/7 awake staff, and then we have the massive clinical team on top of that. It's really important let's say you're looking for a recovery coach or a sober companion or some sort of in-home support, peer support service. It's really important that the person who is wanting to facilitate that understands the role this should play properly in the care continuum, right? This is not a treatment replacement. It can't treat anything. So you want someone who understands how it properly integrates, and also someone who is willing and even requiring that to move forward with it, that the loved one or the person needing the treatment is also engaged with an actual clinical team that are all in communication with each other and in communication with the peer support provider. Next, we have remote supervision and drug and alcohol testing. So you have saliva testing, SoberLink, and TrueLink Financial. So first we'll start with remote monitored saliva testing. This is actually a process that I and my company developed, where we do saliva drug testing over a secure video conference. The benefits of this is that it's less invasive in terms of the supervision requirements than urine collection or urinalysis, and it allows us to supervise from afar someone throughout the fluid collection process. Next, we have SoberLink. SoberLink is a remote monitored breathalyzer technology. It has a built-in front-facing camera that allows for facial recognition with each test to determine if the correct user is taking it. The benefit of this is that you don't even need a test supervisor who's available during the testing process, because the whole thing is automated. And whoever the administrator is of the SoberLink can log into their portal, and they can see the entire testing history. They can see what the blood alcohol content was. They can see the facial recognition proof on each testing process and the times that it was taken. And it's a really great tool for remote supervision. It really allows you to get a lot of supervision with less in-person hours. Then we have TrueLink Financial. TrueLink Financial is a remote supervised debit card that allows the administrator to choose acceptable vendor types, cash withdrawal limits, monitor transaction history, and to disable the card in the event of a suspected relapse or mental health episode. This is really useful for persons who are exiting treatment, right? They have more responsibility coming to them. They need a way of buying things as they integrate into the world. And this is another way of more slowly titrating down that level of care. That's really one of the biggest. So behavioral health support services, like my company does, are best utilized on the front end to get people to agree to go to treatment and to actually get them to the facility, and then on the back end of treatment. And the standard care continuum is detox to residential to sober living in PHP, and then IOP, OP, and then done. And you really see big drops in level of supervision throughout this process. And what these private services do is allow you to more slowly titrate down the level of care and the level of supervision that the client is receiving. This is just saying that all of these services can be utilized in tandem, and you can really provide a lot of supervision without someone even physically present. I mean, we've had clients stay on these services for a year plus, or they'll remove one at some point, but it allows you to monitor both financial uses, blood alcohol, and then also if there are any narcotics in the system. And that's it. So I'll bring Laura back on.
Okay, wonderful. Let me take down your slides so that we can talk. Wow, you're getting a lot of comments in the question box. One is just, this is a whole new industry for me. Someone just expressing a surprise at how many specializations there are. How long has this sort of work, like what you do, what your company, the Recovery Guides, does? How is this always been in place? Some of these things I've never even heard of.
No, it's newer, and it really, a lot of it came to fruition in Southern California. So for example, kind of the concept of a sober companion actually started with the band Aerosmith. They were on tour, and they're using drugs, and it's just a mess. And the tour manager actually contracted this guy who I believe they found through AA. He was a big guy in the Southern California AA scene, to actually tour with them and try to manage it so that they were able to continue playing. And a lot of these services are new. I mean, SoberLink started in 2011. That wasn't a thing before 2011.
Yeah.
Remote monitoring saliva testing I came up with about a year and a half ago. TrueLink Financial is no more than 3 years old. A lot of these are newer services.
Okay, that's great to know.
Transport Co has been around since the 80s.
Okay, well, and a lot of people have, I don't want to use the term given up, but if their loved ones been in addiction for many years, and they're homeless or on the streets, they've tried everything, that. What would you say to someone like that? Let's say your child is 25, 26, and you haven't talked to them. They're homeless somewhere and just very addicted, and you've tried. Is this still a good time to give it another whirl?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely not hopeless. And I firmly believe in family members, taking care of themselves first, right? It's kind of like the airplane analogy. When the oxygen masks drop down on the plane, you have to save yourself. You have to be kind to yourself. But the reality is that we really do have a lot of options for dealing with really severe situations that a lot of people would think are totally hopeless. I mean, it can get as complex as we've worked with consultants and families to, help them get guardianship over their adult children and then get them court ordered into a treatment program. You can try to get them to different states that have more liberal mental health care systems, and how long they're willing to hold someone, and what level of acuity they're willing to deal with over the longer term. California and Utah being two of the most, I would say, aggressive isn't the right word, but they won't just release someone back onto the street who's still in psychosis. It's the problem
Yeah.
is in a lot of these states, if they don't deem them an immediate physical risk to themselves or
Right.
others, they just let them go.
Right. And if you're 3 days on an M1 hold and suicidal and psychotic, and they just let them go and they get out and do attempt a suicide, have a suicide attempt before they take them back for 3 weeks, it just seems crazy that in 3 days they can be let out when they may need another 2 weeks of intensive mental health treatment. Even though they might not be suicidal, they're definitely incapacitated and not able to take care of themselves or live alone in that state.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes it's not even 3 days that they will hold them in a lot of states. I mean, we just had a case, the other week where, the wife was worried about the husband. The husband had wrote a suicide note. He had sent it out to everyone he knew. They got him placed on a hold, and in under 12 hours, they had released him.
Gosh.
And it was, it's supposed to be a 72-hour hold, but it's once he was placed on the hold, he was able to talk his way out of it in under 12 hours. And
Well,
it's
and
just,
sometimes you're really good at manipulating and lying. And if you're on drugs and used to, you have to wonder about anything that comes out of their mouth, whether or not that's true. But they do seem to be able to manipulate and convince the medical staff in many cases that they are not suicidal, and they just take their word for it and let them out. That's exactly what happened to our son, and he was suicidal and told me so.
absolutely.
Said as soon as I get out of here, I'm going to kill myself, and he did try. And I was I can't believe that, as a parent, when you have a mentally ill quote child, even though they're an adult, when they're mentally ill, that there is so little control that you have. And it's frustrating then that now they can watch them for 3 weeks, but they have to try to kill themselves first. I mean, that doesn't make any
Right,
sense to me. Yeah.
right.
Well,
No, I know there's
you
definitely a
can
lot of
get
work still left to be done.
is there legislation that can be, passed that says, hey, if you're an adult and you're mentally ill, that a parent, I mean, we were still financially responsible for him, paying for college, paying for living expenses. It seems if someone's in school, for example, you should be able to have more of a say in that, in their mental health. But of course, the university wouldn't tell us anything. So
Right,
frustrating. Just seems
right.
like something should be done.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think the overall trend is in a positive direction throughout the country, but you really get a lot of state variability. And I mean, I've had clients who are still actively delusional and in psychosis discharged within 24 hours just because they're not presenting as necessarily violent or aggressive towards themselves or others. Just
Wow.
because they're compliant, but they're still fully in psychosis, they're delusional, and they refuse medication, and so the hospital just discharges them.
And so can you get to another state? Convince your loved one to go on a vacation to California and do the intervention there. Maybe that's it.
Yeah, you can, and I've advised families of that before, especially with the more severe cases. California does, I think, probably the best job in terms of holding people and actually getting them medically stable before releasing them.
Wow. Okay. One question is, tell us, if you will, what a family meeting looks like. You described a family meeting. Someone just wanted to a little more clarity around that. Could you kind of walk us through, the
Sure.
letters and, they come in and then what happens?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it depends on the submodality that's being used. If you've seen the TV show Intervention, that is a fairly popular, although more old school form of holding the family meeting. And it would generally be, they invite the loved one to show up. And then when they show up, all the members of the family or potentially some friends are there. They have letters pre-crafted. Usually the bulk of the letter will be, how much the person means to them. And then the kind of final statements will be the bottom lines, right? The kind of leverage points of, and if you don't accept help today, we won't do A or B or C. Our model of intervention is a bit different. So we actually don't write down we don't have people write letters. We prefer for the interventions to just kind of get briefed on the different statements that the family members will use prior, because, we think there's value in eye contact and sincerity and things being more organic and not as, pre-contrived or crafted. And our general format, the different statements will largely fall into the categories of what has everyone seen, the facts of the situation, what does everyone hope will happen as a result of this, which is always, you'll accept help, you'll be happy, healthy, a member of the family, etc. And then lastly, what does everyone fear will happen if the loved one does not accept help today? And those are often, pretty dire fears, and that's the reality of what we're dealing with these behavioral health issues.
And so the letters, that's an optional thing. Whether or not they read that, it depends on whether they need a script or something to be more comfortable, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, it really just depends on the modality that the interventionist is using. So we actually won't, like, we wouldn't personally allow letter reading.
You don't do
Because
that.
the reality is, it's like,
Yeah.
when the interventionist is taking a very active role in it, the family members know what they've seen, right? It's like you don't have to have it wrote down, and it's okay if you don't recite it verbatim from what you would write down, right? The point is just to in the most sincere way convey what have you seen. And this is all very fresh and real to the members of the family that have been witnessing this for however long it's been going on. And so we
Right.
prefer, our style of intervention is very active on the interventionist part, and they need to memorize all of these statements from all the family members and be able to organically weave and orchestrate that in the moment, depending on how the loved one is responding.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Next question. What if a loved one rejects the intervention? So, kind of how often are you successful? What are the statistics? What typically happens as a result of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And success rate is definitely going to vary a lot depending on interventionist. And it's also, so we don't like to pitch our success rate because I like to always tell families that, look, every case is different and we can't guarantee a result.
Sure.
The reality is that our success rate is very high. I think we've had one person not go in 2021
Okay.
out of all the interventions we've done, and we've probably done about 25 to 30. So we have a good success rate, but the reality is that every situation is different, and just because there is the general success rate is high doesn't mean that a specific situations that's necessarily going to translate into that. And if the person doesn't agree to go, I mean, the first thing we would look at is if the family is financially supporting them in any way. We would coach the family on really not enabling the loved one, right? And so it's not uncommon that we'll get people who are resistant and refuse to go initially as part of the family meeting, and then we will coach the family on withholding resources from that person. And typically within 24 hours of that process, the person is agreeing to go.
Because they're dependent on them, and what else can they do at that point?
Right.
Okay.
I've heard, the empty threat of I'll just, live on the streets many, many, many times. And the reality is that it's exceedingly rare that persons who weren't already living on the street are going to actually go live on the street.
That's a very difficult lifestyle when they face the reality of doing it.
Right, and we do, and those are some of the hardest interventions you can do, though, is with the persons who are seasoned in that lifestyle. And we do that a lot. I mean, we do a lot of missing persons recovery, of homeless persons who are mentally ill and addicted to drugs, and we're going out and locating them, and it is difficult because you really have no leverage points. That they already don't have resources, and they're accustomed to that lifestyle, and a lot of them unfortunately really like that lifestyle.
Wow.
It feels like too much to live in, within the confines of normal, social decency or culture. It overwhelms them.
Wow. So it sounds like a lot of the training then is training the family on boundaries. Perhaps they have been enablers in the past. Perhaps they themselves are using marijuana, right? And then all of a sudden your child is in full-blown cannabis-induced psychosis, and you have to admit that you yourself are using, or that there's marijuana in the home. Do you find that in those situations that they don't tend to self-report that? Is that usually kind of uncovered?
Yeah, definitely. I would say they very rarely, self-report that. And that stuff will oftentimes, I mean, I've even had it come up when the adolescent or the loved one is actually in treatment and they're opening up to, their primary therapist. And then we start getting all this information on the dysfunction of the family of origin. And so, we've even stepped in after, a month or two into the treatment process, when we have more information, stepped in, as long as we're doing case management, to address the rest of the family members. And really, at a minimum, we want every member of the family to be connected with a therapist.
Right. Well, and certainly if they're over 21, and it's quote legal, doesn't mean that it's a good environment for the child, that it's being a good role model. And if they're allowing use, for example, thinking, oh, it's helping my child with the stress. There's a real false narrative out there that we hear. And, I'm in Colorado, I know you are too, but everybody's listening to us from all over. Even if it's not legal in your state, the media, the industry, the advertisements, everybody wants everyone to believe that it's safe and it's natural and it's harmless. And some parents don't even know that that is the case. They're often shocked to find their child addicted or having mental health issues from marijuana.
Yep.
So do you ever then have to turn around and treat the parent, not that they're not doing something legal, in Colorado, but that it's role modeling the wrong behavior? I read a study that said something really high, like 80% of youth whose parents use marijuana will use, so do you see a lot of that kind of codependent behavior that you end up needing to treat both and the whole family?
Oh, absolutely. We definitely see it. I mean, it's not the usual that we end up placing someone in, let's say residential treatment for substance use disorder who's not the loved one, but it's not that uncommon either. And it oftentimes, did originate or get its start in the family system like that. And it's really sad. I mean, I've encountered, it brings one case to mind from a couple months ago. The parents started giving their son cannabis to smoke when he was 13 years old, and smoking with him, because they were like, he's anxious, it'll calm him down, right? I truly believe they were well intentioned in it. They're really nice people.
Right, because it's just bad information that they're getting.
And 18 months later, he's smoking meth on Colfax in downtown Denver. And it's really like, it's a very bad case now.
Do you see that a lot, where, that quote kind of innocent, it's just weed, marijuana use? You even mentioned in your own story, if I may ask, does that tend to lead to other things? Do you find like marijuana is this gateway? People say, I mean, the research shows that it's kind of a gateway drug. Do you see that in reality?
Yes, absolutely. And especially when, I think it's also dependent on on how it's being used. When you start experiencing emotional difficulty and lean on some sort of psychoactive substance as your crutch, like that's the recipe for ever progressing addiction issues. I mean, that's how it was with me. That's how it is with the kids I'm working with. You know, they become depressed or anxious, and then either them or their parent comes up with the idea of, you know, let's try THC or smoking pot or whatever it is to help cope with this. Like you're lighting the fire for a long-term substance use or addiction problem.
That's
Because
a great phrase.
they're habituating at such a young age that this is how I feel better. And then
Ah,
they'll either, you know, even if they're not prone towards cannabis-induced psychosis or bipolar or something like that, it's going to stop working as well pretty quickly. And then they're going to be inclined towards stepping into new things.
not being able to find that same high again that they first experienced, you know. And then of course you have the kids that are just wanting to get high. They're normal kids who aren't mentally ill or unhappy or depressed or neglected or anxious. They just want to get high. You know, it's at every party. It's amazing. It's at college. Our youngest son is in college, and he says it's
Mhm.
just everywhere. You know, even if you're not depressed or down or sad, it just seems to be kind of the normal party thing. You know, hey, let's just, you know, we're just going to smoke a little weed. And if it becomes normalized like that, you could end up getting yourself in trouble without even knowing it, you know, without knowing how it's going to affect you. It just seems like some people are affected and some people aren't. And
Yeah.
you just don't know which
No, you
one
don't know.
you're going to be.
Yeah. Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
exactly. You really have no idea, and there's people are far too quiet about the very real potential consequences with
yes.
THC discussion, and I see it all the time. Almost every day, I see new cases of kids who are experiencing, you know, cannabis-induced psychosis, or they're now diagnosed bipolar. You know, I have a kid in California who is on his second, you know, multi-day hold in the last month,
Uh,
triggered and brought on by THC ingestion. And it's really sad. And we see it with, you know, the age group of 16 to 24 very, very regularly.
people are just chiming in. That's 100% so true. That is my loved one's story. They want to know if you speak to high schools. Do you give presentations in high schools?
I have. I have. I wouldn't say I do it regularly, but I moved to Colorado from San Francisco, and I spoke at a fair number of high schools there. So
Yeah.
that's definitely something that, you know, that we love to do.
Well, and especially since it happened to you, you know, there's authenticity there, and it's reality, and it's your story. She wants to know, what is their reaction? You know, do you ever have teens push back and go, that never happened to me, or you know, that's marijuana's not
Yeah, I mean,
addictive.
I think a lot of them feel like that, right? You know, it's going and speaking for one 45-minute session isn't necessarily going to be enough to change the trajectory of a, you know, stubborn 16-year-old, and it certainly wasn't enough to change mine. You know, we had people come in and talk about it when I was in high school. You know, we watched the videos on it,
Right.
but the reality is that I was very set, and I was also 100% experiencing an addiction or substance use disorder by the age of 14.
Wow. It's hard. It's hard. Someone wants to know about a typical process. You mentioned, and they said they didn't catch it, the continuum. There were a lot of acronyms that you used. Could you go through that again? You know,
Sure, sure.
detox, you know, all the way through, and like actually spell them out so we get them on the
Yeah.
recording.
Yeah, we'll get it. So typically people will start with detox. Sometimes they'll even, you know, this is the medical detox, right? Like let's say someone is physically dependent on alcohol. They have to go to medical detox before the rest of the treatment process, because if they just cease use with no medical care, they can have a seizure and actually die. And this is the
What
case
about
with
THC? What's the detox for? I mean, we've heard that it's fat soluble and can stay in your system 3 weeks. How does one detox from THC? What's that first step?
So it would really just be time. I mean, someone who is only ingesting THC wouldn't really need medical detox. They
Unless
could
they're in
actually
active psychosis, like in the ER room.
right, and then it wouldn't even be the detox that they needed. They would need psychiatric stabilization in a psych hospital. So
Okay.
they would need, it's not, they wouldn't need, oftentimes in detox, they use some narcotic drugs to ease withdrawal symptoms. For someone who's
Gotcha.
in THC-induced psychosis, they don't need the narcotics to ease the
No.
withdrawal symptoms. They need, antipsychotics and mood stabilizers to bring down the psychosis back to a baseline.
Okay. So there's some sort of detox, ER, moving to, a psych recovery. And then you mentioned moving into like a residential rehab.
Correct. Yeah. So some sort of inpatient care facility. Yeah, typically when you're searching for treatment in your area, a lot of the options that are going to come up are going to be residential options. And so this is, full 24-hour a day supervision. The house is staffed constantly. Typically, all of the clinical sessions are happening in the facility itself, and this is really the highest level of care after. This is also where the treatment actually starts, right? In detox, maybe you'll meet with a therapist or psychiatrist, but you're not going to begin, you're not ready yet. You're not to baseline enough to actually, be engaging with group and engaging in a more in-depth way with individual therapy.
And so then what's that next piece? So you stay at the residential rehab, how long? Weeks?
Typically 30 days.
30 days. Okay. And then what?
Then I mean, it's, the unfortunate reality is that a lot of people come home after too brief a stint in some sort of treatment environment. But the best thing to do is to then transition to a supportive living with PHP or partial hospitalization program.
PHP, partial hospitalization program, and supportive living. So describe for us what that looks like. Is that a sober house?
Correct. Yeah.
Or a
Yeah.
step down?
Correct. Yeah. There's a lot of different words for it. It could be extended care or sober house or step down or
Okay.
whatever it may be. But this will typically be, there's a separate living environment that hopefully has supervision, at the minimum a live-in house manager who's, drug testing people and breathalyzing, et cetera. And then you have a separate location where they are receiving outpatient treatment services. So PHP all the way down to OP is oftentimes facilitated in the same building. And it is really just different levels of hours per week of outpatient therapy. And this is a mix of individual therapy, typically a lot of group therapy, and also potentially medication management with a psychiatrist or MD that is also contracted or full-time with the outpatient facility.
Wow. And then how long is that, since you're, I assume, making friends, living in a house with other people who are in recovery like you are, how long does then one stay there? And then what's the next step?
Totally variable. And the reality is that it's largely more dependent on cash resources available and the quality of the insurance policy than it is, what's actually best for the person. Because insurance will try to stop paying as soon as possible. I mean, insurance oftentimes a week or two into residential treatment will cut benefits.
Wow.
And then the programs have to switch to, billing for PHP or IOP or whatever it may be. And there's a lot of rules and regulations around, what the treatment has to look like to be able to legally bill for that. I mean, that's why, supportive living and PHP have to take place in different facilities. They can't be at the same address, and that's dictated by insurance. And insurance, once you are out of residential care, insurance is not agreeing to pay for any sort of housing cost.
And so is that where you said ideally they will go into a sober living, but many times they come home, which may bring them right back into their old patterns, and that might not be the best place for them at that time. If you're financially unable,
for long-term, integrated with life free care, the best option is a lot of the peer support fellowships such as Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Marijuana Anonymous, Smart Recovery, Refuge Recovery, which is a Buddhist type of peer support fellowship. Those are a lot of times with the best success stories we see, those persons actively engaged with those free peer support fellowships long term, right?
Wow.
Because
Okay. In the home, and you would move out of the sober living facility. So that could be a several month stay at one of those sober homes.
Oh, or more. I mean, some of the best programs in the country for especially young adults. I mean, it gets harder to stay for a year if you're have kids and a job, et cetera, right? It becomes unrealistic.
But for young people,
a year plus. I mean, there are programs that are multi-year programs.
wow. What are some of the best kind of young people, say 18 to 24, dual diagnosis, recovering from cannabis use or a similar substance? Are there some common ones off the top of your head that you can say these are the kind of top 5 programs in the country you'd recommend?
Yeah, I mean, for long term, like a year plus of treatment, I would say the top in Colorado are Jaywalker, which is in Carbondale, Colorado, and Choice House, which is in Boulder, Colorado.
And what if their money was no object and they could send their child anywhere in the United States? What are the best programs for young people?
So it's hard to say that, right? And that's where you would need, it's placement will be, the reality is there's a lot of bad programs, but there's a lot of good programs too. And that's where the value of a clinician, an interventionist, and therapeutic consultant all come into play for help ascertaining what is the correct placement.
And that's where they could go to the association of Interventionist Specialists that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if I went over it during the actual presentation, but the best combination would be, if resources are not an obstacle, would be to have a licensed clinician who is also a therapeutic consultant paired with an intervention team. And that's really the best team and the best chance you can have of, one, getting the person to treatment, and two, being sure that it is the proper fit.
That's so important. Okay, last question. How can we get the judicial system to work with individuals released? So families need education so individuals don't relapse to those family norms. Any insights on that?
Could you repeat the question, please?
She wants to know, how can we get the judicial system to work with these individuals who are released? Because the families, it just seems like it's so easy for them to relapse. Is there any way that legally we can help support them with some restrictions? Do you ever see that happening, or is it just because this is why a lot of these rules exist, because it violated so many of their rights, being able to put them into treatment without their consent, that it seems like it's kind of gone the other way. Do you see any legal changes on the horizon for parents?
Not necessarily. I'm not aware of any. Florida is actually one of the easier states to get people court ordered into treatment. And they will do it it can be for a substance use disorder primary rather than some sort of thought disorder, like is often required in other states to get someone, mandated or put on a hold. Florida is probably one of the easiest. It's called the Marchman Act. And you can actually get someone who's struggling specifically with substance use disorder, who may have no other mental health conditions, court ordered into treatment.
The Marchman Act, that's good. So if we wanted to look at bringing legislation like that to our own states, that may be a good place to start.
Absolutely.
Well, the last question/comment that we have here is, Dear Jordan, I've worked in the substance use field for 30 years and the information you are giving is wonderful and very useful. Thank you. So I will just echo that comment and add my thanks, Jordan, and just to let you know how much I appreciate you and how helpful you have been to me personally, calling you randomly, asking you questions. I do appreciate your help, as Johnny's Ambassadors is primarily involved in education and prevention and awareness, and we don't do intervention and treatment. However, it is very helpful and much appreciated to have someone like you in my corner that I've been able to ask questions to. So thank you personally, and thank you collectively from all of us here at Johnny's Ambassadors.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. It was a pleasure and honor to be able to present. I mean, this is something that's truly, it's near and dear to my heart. I mean, I saw how this progression almost took my own life, and it took many of my friends' lives at a young age, so.
Well, and even though you're in Colorado, this applies to everyone, no matter where they are, and it's so important for them to be able to find the right help. So thank you for leading us on that journey. And thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time here on Johnny's Ambassadors. Take care. Bye-bye.